Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with a clink, a gasp, and a piece of shattered glass that wasn't just champagne, it was legacy illusion, and a lot of fake smiles hitting the floor all at once. The moment Vanessa's crystal flute slipped from her hand and crashed into jagged pieces on the marble tile, you could have heard a pin drop if anyone had dared breathe. I'd just said 8 words. I still own the family's lakeside cabin. Simple words, but apparently not ones she expected to hear from a woman she and Michael had already boxed out of their lives like last season's furniture. You might be wondering how we got here. Me, Eleanor Winters, retired schoolteacher, wearing my mother's pearls and a navy dress, calmly dropping a 40-year-old truth bomb into my only child's engagement celebration. Well, you're not alone. So before you feel too smug thinking this is just another dramatic family story with a sassy older woman and some spoiled millennials, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Drop your location and the time where you are right now in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get started tonight. The truth is, I hadn't planned on saying anything that night. I really hadn't. I'd brought the documents with me as a backup, tucked inside my purse, between a butterscotch candy and a travel-sized packet of tissues, like any respectable 68-year-old woman with secrets. But then Michael stood up in that glass and marble fortress of a dining room and said, "We're planning to rebuild the old family cabin. Dad found the site. It'll be our wedding gift." As if that cabin were a fixer-upper waiting for some sleek architect to bulldoze it into a designer lake house. As if Richard, my ex-husband, who once referred to my teaching salary as cute, had any right to offer that land like a party favor. I took a long sip of the champagne they'd poured for me, expensive, effervescent, and oddly flavorless, like most of their curated life. Then I smiled. "That's fascinating," I said, "because I still own it." That's when Vanessa's hand trembled and the glass hit the floor. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. To be fair, mine hadn't either for 4 decades. The irony wasn't lost on me. 40 years of silence broken by a few syllables and the sound of Waterford crystal giving up the ghost. Let me back up for just a second. Not too far, though we're not here for a history lecture. I was 25 when that cabin became mine in every way that mattered. My father, a construction foreman with more integrity than Richard could rent in a lifetime, built it with his own hands in 1952. No blueprints, no contractors. Just sawdust, calloused fingers, and sheer belief that something well-made could outlast a man. Appearances can be deceiving, he used to say, handing me a fishing pole taller than I was. But ownership is truth. Of course, that kind of wisdom isn't trending on TikTok these days, but maybe it should be. Here's a quirky aside. Did you know flamingos can only be pink because of their diet of shrimp and algae? Without the right nutrients, they'd be white, colorless. All appearances, no substance. Think about that the next time someone flaunts a curated lifestyle. Anyway, that cabin wasn't just 4 walls and a dock. It was the only piece of solid ground in my life that didn't shift when everything else did, including my marriage. I met Richard when I was still teaching at a public high school, back when I wore chalk on my clothes, like a badge of honor, and thought marrying into money meant I'd have more room to breathe. Turns out all the air in the world doesn't help when the windows don't open. The divorce messy, public, predictable. Richard's family played it like a sport. Their attorneys were all tailored suits and barely veiled condescension. The cabin is a marital asset, they declared. It must be liquidated. Liquidated, like it was a clearance item. But here's the academic debate. No one invited me to what defines value in a legacy market price. A deed, or 4 generations of laughter echoing off pine trees. I had my answer 3 months before I filed for divorce. I worked with Sarah, my college roommate turned estate attorney, to transfer ownership of the cabin into a private trust. My maiden name, my terms, my secret. Not out of spite, out of survival. I let them believe it was sold. I nodded through Richard's fake sympathy. Shame about the cabin, Ellie, while I paid property taxes with my teacher's salary and learned to patch a leaky roof with YouTube tutorials before YouTube was even a thing. And every year for 2 quiet weeks in the summer, I went back. Back to the creaky floorboards and the smell of cedar and coffee. Back to the dock, where Michael once dropped his peanut butter sandwich in the lake and cried like he'd lost a limb. Back to the wind chimes my mother made from mismatched silverware and fishing line. I went alone. Because Michael was with his father in Europe, learning to pronounce portfolio diversification before he learned to drive. The first time he asked me why we never went back to the lake, I told him, "That place is gone now, sweetheart." Half true, like most of parenting. But here's what I've learned at my age: sometimes the truth isn't what you say, it's what you keep alive. And that night, with broken glass glittering on the floor and stunned silence humming louder than any jazz playlist they'd queued up for ambiance, I realized the time for silence had passed. I leaned forward and said it again, clearly this time. The cabin was never sold. I've owned it all along. No performance, no drama, just truth. And let me tell you the truth when it finally shows up after decades of being kept quiet. She doesn't whisper. She roars. The photograph sits in a walnut frame on my bookshelf. You wouldn't know it meant anything, just looking at it faded a little, the corners curled with time. But for me, it's a snapshot of everything I was trying to hold together, and everything I knew I was about to lose. I'm 25 in the photo. My hair's pulled back my face, softer still, round from youth, but carrying shadows under the eyes. Beside me, little Michael, 4 years old, smile wide enough to split his face in half, is holding a half-eaten popsicle and wearing a t-shirt 2 sizes too big. It was the last summer before the divorce. We're standing outside the family cabin, my father's cabin at Pine Ridge Lake. He built it in '52, the year after he came back from Korea, and swore never to live in a house with drywall again. He didn't trust it said anything that thin couldn't hold in real warmth. There's a way you pose when you know a photograph will outlast the moment. I stood straight, hand gently on Michael's shoulder, my other arm crossed over my stomach, like I was trying to hold myself together from the inside out. It wasn't vanity. It was grief management. And maybe that's the funny part, how grief always shows up in the framings. I didn't know that day would become the image I'd carry around like a bookmark through the rest of my life. But it did. Old age fact of the night: our brains are biologically wired to assign deeper emotional meaning to memories that coincide with big transitions: divorce, death, birth. Or in my case, the subtle collapse of a marriage with a very expensive view and no structural integrity. Michael had no idea, of course. He was just mad I wouldn't let him eat 2 popsicles. "One's for now. One's for the ride home," he said, with the stern negotiation tactics of a preschooler who knew the value of freezing sugar. I laughed, then cried in the car an hour later. I'd already made the decision to transfer the deed by that point. Sarah had walked me through the process twice over the phone, and again in her tiny office with the squeaky leather chair and the pencil jar full of red licorice. We'd created a private trust in my maiden name, Eleanor Jameson, with just enough legal scaffolding to keep Richard's lawyer from sniffing it out. "You're not deceiving anyone," she told me, sealing the papers with her no-nonsense stamp. "You're protecting what matters. There's a difference. There always is. And yet it's a debate that lingers. Does silence become complicity when you let someone believe they've won? Academic debate phrase of the night. It's a contested ethical boundary. What one party conceals in good faith may be perceived by another as strategic deception. In other words, just because it feels right doesn't mean it won't look shady in court. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always come wrapped in good lighting and a confident voiceover. Sometimes it's stuffed in an envelope you tuck into your purse, waiting for a day that may or may not come. I remember that summer like it was pressed in wax. Michael and I made pancakes on the wood stove, well I did, and he flung flour across the counter like it was snow. We fished off the dock. We picked wild blueberries from the same tangled bushes my dad used to trim back every spring. I pretended it was normal, all of it. That next summer would be the same. That I wouldn't soon be back in the city dividing furniture and smiling politely, while Richard took his junior associate to dinner in the places we used to celebrate anniversaries. And every time I caught Michael gazing up at me mid-story or mid-marshmallow roast, I smiled like nothing was changing. But inside, everything was already splitting in half. Quirky fact of the night. Did you know the common snapping turtle can live up to 100 years and never moves more than a couple miles from where it hatched? That kind of loyalty to place has always fascinated me. Some creatures just know where home is, and they protect it without apology. When the divorce became official, I moved into a small apartment across town. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, creaky floors. Michael adjusted quickly the way kids do, but his weekends with Richard started to stretch into entire summers. Paris, Geneva, Santorini. At first, he sent postcards. Later, he just sent photos from his phone, curated smiles under curated lighting. His father's new family reflected in mirrored sunglasses. I never told him I was still going back to Pine Ridge every summer. It felt like a betrayal I couldn't justify at the time, but also like the only part of my life that still belonged entirely to me. 2 weeks. That's all I ever took. Sometimes in July, sometimes September, when the trees began turning copper and the lake water lost its warmth. I cleaned the gutters, patched the roof, refinished the dock. Once I rebuilt a screen door after a raccoon mauled it. I called it my pilgrimage, though it wasn't spiritual in the obvious sense. It was repair, restoration, return. One summer, Michael asked about the cabin. He was 10, maybe 11. Did we sell the lake house? He asked, all big eyes and unbrushed hair, sitting at the kitchen table with cereal floating in milk he wouldn't drink. I hesitated. My first instinct was the truth. But the truth was complicated. That place is gone now, sweetheart. He looked disappointed, but only for a moment. Then he started telling me about the surfboard his father bought him in Monaco. I spent that summer crying quietly while scrubbing mildew off the cabin's north wall. The pain didn't come from his lack of curiosity. It came from how quickly he moved on. But children are not born with an innate understanding of legacy. They inherit it through what we choose to say and what we dare to preserve when no one is looking. And that's what I was doing, quietly, invisibly, year after year, preserving. There's a strange peace in being invisible, as long as you're the one choosing it. For 40 years, I wore my invisibility like armor. I was the woman who nodded politely when Richard offered condolences about the cabin being unfortunately liquidated. I was the mother who smiled through graduation dinners with Michael's finance friends, none of whom remembered my name the second the check hit the table. And I was the ex-wife who knew more about trust law than she let on. But behind all that, I was also the trustee of a lakeside property no one remembered I owned. Richard had underestimated me from the very beginning. That's his sport. He likes confident women, but only if they make him look more important by comparison. In our marriage, my opinions were charming, and my ideas were ambitious, but perhaps not fully developed. Which is rich, considering he once tried to microwave a metal travel mug and blamed the manufacturer. It didn't surprise me when, during our divorce, he focused on the cabin like it was some grand prize. What did surprise me was the casual cruelty of it all. Sentimentality doesn't hold up in court, his lawyer said once, flipping through pages like my life was a ledger. The property's value is primarily in the land. The structure will likely be torn down anyway. That word again, torn down. It echoed in my chest like a door slammed in the wind. But the joke, of course, was on them. Because while they were busy assigning a dollar amount to my father's stone fireplace and rough-hewn beams, they didn't realize I'd already moved the goalposts. 3 months before Richard served me with papers, I transferred the cabin into a private trust under my maiden name. The document was quietly notarized in Sarah's office, while her intern brought us coffee and never even looked up from her phone. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a quiet reshuffling of legal reality. But that quiet moment was everything. It meant that no matter how many golf club memberships Richard bragged about, no matter how many vacations he took with Stephanie, yes, that Stephanie, his junior associate, he'd never touch that cabin. Ownership is truth. Remember, my father was right. Again, academic debate phrase of the day. In situations of asymmetric power, strategic concealment can become a tool of survival rather than a breach of ethical transparency. I read that in a journal once, clipped it out, stuck it to my fridge with a magnet shaped like a trout. Michael, though, he never questioned the narrative. He was a teenager by the time Richard started painting himself as the magnanimous provider, and me as the sweet, slightly naive relic of another era. I suppose I made it easy. I didn't fight for attention. I didn't correct the story. I just waited and preserved. When people ask how I managed financially after the divorce, I smile and say, public school teachers are the world's most resourceful creatures. Which is true. I clipped coupons. I taught summer school. I made casseroles that could stretch across 3 meals. And I kept paying property taxes on a lakeside cabin no one thought I still owned. That's the thing about quiet women. We get underestimated until the day we don't. Every year, I'd drive up to Pine Ridge in my dented Civic with the sticky cup holder and the taped-up side mirror. I kept the schedule secret even from colleagues. I'd tell people I was visiting an old friend. And in a way, I was. The cabin never judged me. It didn't care that my shoes were scuffed or my knees creaked when I bent to weed the garden beds. It didn't need networking connections or investment strategies. It just needed sanding and sealing and the occasional raccoon eviction. And in exchange, it gave me peace. It gave me continuity. It gave me my father's voice in my head, reminding me that worth isn't always loud. Quirky fact of the night. Octopuses. Yes, octopuses, not octopi, can edit their own RNA. That's basically like rewriting your software on the fly. You know who else does that? Divorced women over 40 who find themselves suddenly in charge of everything from plumbing to parenting to emotional triage. Let me tell you, I've done more rewiring in the walls of that cabin than most people do in a lifetime. And I'm not just talking electrical. One summer, around the time Michael graduated college, the old dock started giving out. Rotting boards, rusty nails, the works. I didn't have the money to replace the whole thing professionally, so I did what any budget-savvy woman would do. I called in a favor. Mrs. Carruthers from the English department had a brother-in-law who did small construction gigs for friendly rates. We bartered I-baked pies, and 2 weekends later, I had a sturdy new dock built from reclaimed pine. The only thing I couldn't reclaim, my relationship with Michael. He stopped calling regularly around that time. His career took off, and our conversations became clipped and transactional. I got texts on my birthday. A card at Christmas usually signed by Vanessa, not him. And when he did visit, he looked at my apartment like it was a particularly complex math problem. You know, Mom, you could move somewhere a little more comfortable. There are good investment consultants who could help you stretch that pension. He meant well. Probably. But I wanted to say, Michael, sweetheart. My idea of comfort isn't granite countertops and a parking space with a valet. It's waking up with birdsong outside my window and knowing the floor won't collapse when I step into the shower. But I didn't say it. I just smiled and thought about the cabin, the place he'd forgotten, the place he'd once loved, and the place he was about to be reminded of in the most unforgettable way. The last time Michael and I had a real conversation before all the champagne and marble and shattered glass, it wasn't about feelings or memories. It was about guest lists. Not mine, of course. Vanessa had just sent me an email titled Final Wedding Logistics. Please read. The words please read were in bold. Vanessa loves a bold font. It makes things feel important even when they're not. Inside the email was a color-coded spreadsheet with tabs for vendor schedules, flight itineraries, seating charts, and wardrobe expectations. My name, I noticed, appeared exactly once under Mother of the Groom attending TBD. TBD. I sat there staring at the screen like it had personally insulted my potato salad recipe. Because what Vanessa meant by TBD wasn't "we forgot to confirm." It was, "we're still deciding whether your presence supports the aesthetic." Now, if you're thinking I should have been outraged, you're right. I should have. But instead I laughed, because sometimes the only thing left to do is let the ridiculousness wash over you like bad perfume. A week later, Vanessa asked me to lunch. When a woman who refers to you as Michael's sweet mum invites you to a bistro with more truffle on the menu than actual food, you know something's about to go down. She arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and an underfed expression. "Eleanor," she said, setting down her mineral water with the delicacy of someone trying not to smudge her lip gloss, "we're creating a very specific vibe for the wedding weekend. And we just want you to feel comfortable. Translation, we'd like you not to come." I didn't flinch. "Well, I own a navy dress, and I know how to hold a fork, so I think I'll manage." She gave me a tight smile, the kind that says you're charming, but exhausting, and pushed ahead. "Michael's father is bringing several important business associates, and with everything that's happened, the dynamic might be challenging." Challenging, another Vanessa word. It's like awkward, but dressed up in a cashmere wrap. I nodded slowly, letting her play it out. She wasn't done. "We thought perhaps we could do something more intimate when we return. Just the three of us. A private dinner to celebrate together." "Ah, a consolation prize. Like a scented candle in a gift bag." "I see," I said, taking a sip of my water. "You're uninviting me from my only child's wedding, but offering me a thank you dinner in return." Vanessa blinked. Just once. But it was the blink of someone realizing I wasn't going to cooperate with her monogrammed plan. Old age wisdom for the day. If you need to curate someone out of your wedding to protect your image, maybe it's not an image worth curating. Quirky fact. Male seahorses carry the babies. They gestate them labor through contractions and pop those little guys out like confetti. Why? Because evolution occasionally has a sense of humor, and maybe because roles are more flexible than we think. I went home from that lunch not angry but resolved. That's when I called Sarah. The woman's been my friend for 45 years. We've laughed through breakups, funerals, and a horrifying double date involving a mechanical bull and a man named Leonard. But in her office, she's pure precision. Sharp corners, sharper mind. Her office still smells like paper and quiet ambition. "You've maintained that trust for 4 decades, she said, flipping through her records like she could do it blindfolded. "You sure you want to change the beneficiary now?" I'm not sure of anything I admitted, except that if my son doesn't think I belong in his future, he might not deserve the legacy I've preserved for his. She gave a slow nod. "Then let's make a list. First, what exactly does Michael know?" That was the million-dollar question. Did he suspect? Did Richard tell him anything? Sarah promised to investigate discreetly. "Give me a few days," she said, already pulling out a yellow legal pad. "You go visit the cabin. See how it feels?" I did just that. The drive up to Pine Ridge has always been a meditation. Trees lining the road like old friends, the turnoff still unmarked after all these years. No billboards. No shortcuts. Just gravel and memory. The cabin looked the same. Weathered, strong, waiting. The porch creaked like it always did, and the screen door still stuck just a little when you pulled it too fast. I opened the windows and let in the lake breeze. Pine and water and earth. The smell of something real. Inside, I ran my hand over the wood kitchen table, the same one Michael used to colour on. The crayon marks were still faintly visible under the varnish. I'd never sanded them out. I didn't cry. I didn't make tea and stare out the window dramatically like a Hallmark character. I just sat, and I thought. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was time stacked and folded into cedar siding and stone. I slept there that night, first time in years. I lit the oil lamp my father had kept on the mantel. I read one of the old books in the shelf, Tennyson, his favourite. and I listened to the creak of the roof settling in the cool air. The same sound it always made when the temperature dropped just enough. That night, I dreamt of my father. He didn't say anything in the dream. He just stood by the dock, holding a mug of coffee, watching the lake. Calm, solid. As if to say, it's still yours. All of it. The land, the choice, the voice. And when I woke up, I knew what I had to do. The cabin wouldn't be inherited by default anymore. If Michael wanted it, if he deserved it, he'd have to show me why. It was the kind of morning where everything feels like it's holding its breath. The lake was smooth as a glass tabletop, barely a ripple in sight, and even the birds seemed slower, quieter, like they were eavesdropping on my thoughts. I sat on the dock legs, crossed thermos of coffee in hand, and stared out at the water, waiting for something that I wasn't even sure would come. I wasn't sentimental by nature, not anymore anyway. But there's something about that place that opens up old memories like an overstuffed photo album. The kind where pages stick together and photos fall out, curling at the corners. That's what Michael used to do as a child, collect pine cones. Not rocks, not bugs. Pine cones. He had a whole collection of them in an old shoebox labeled in crayon forest treasures. I still have it somewhere tucked in the attic of the cabin, right next to my father's fishing vest. There was a time he would run up and down this dock, laughing, yelling out the names he made up for the boats that passed by. Back when his world was small, and his joy didn't need a bank account to be valid. But all that had faded like so many things in our relationship. Michael hadn't become cruel. He hadn't become his father. Not exactly. He'd just absorbed a worldview, one where comfort was performance, where a mother who lived in a modest apartment couldn't possibly be living by choice. Old age truth bomb of the day. Your kids don't stop being yours when they grow up, but they do start editing the version of you they want to believe. And the version Michael believed, it was polite, wholesome, slightly out of date, like a VHS tape left on a shelf for too long. When he first got his job in finance, he called to tell me about his new office view. 27th floor, Mum. You can see the whole skyline. You'd love it. Sounds nice, I'd said. Can you see the sun from there? Not really, but it's still a great view. And that right there, that was it. He didn't even notice that a view without sunlight wasn't really a view at all. The next few years were a blur of Instagram-worthy vacations, work parties I wasn't invited to, and increasingly stylized holiday cards that came with embossed envelopes and little to no warmth inside. Vanessa arrived sometime in year 3 of all this. She was pretty polished and terrifyingly efficient. The kind of woman who probably had a backup battery for her phone and a backup plan for your personality. Michael tells me you were quite the hostess back in the day, she once said to me during a brunch in their high-rise kitchen. I smiled. Back in the day, yes. When people showed up without spreadsheets. She laughed. I think. Hard to tell with people who smile without their eyes. There's an academic phrase I once taught my AP English students, narrative exclusion. It's when someone subtly edits someone else out of a story without saying it out loud. It's the difference between saying, my mom always helped me with my homework, and I always figured things out on my own. Michael had started doing that. Slowly, in wedding plans, in conversations, in the way he talked about his childhood as if it had started at 13 in Geneva. Quirky fact break. Did you know that ravens can hold grudges against specific humans for years? They remember faces, they tell their friends, and they adapt their behavior accordingly. Which, frankly, is a level of emotional intelligence I think some humans could take notes from. Anyway, after my cabin visit and the conversation with Sarah, I waited. Waited to hear what she found out about what Richard knew. Waited to see if Michael would call. Waited for the right moment to act. But time is not a patient teacher. It was Sarah who called first. You might want to sit down, she said. Never a phrase you want to hear from a woman with a law degree and a whisper that could cut granite. Turns out, Richard had discovered the trust 6 months prior. He knew I still owned the cabin. And in classic Richard fashion, he saw an opportunity. He'd already reached out to a Pine Ridge real estate contact. Had someone monitoring the property, probably imagining himself the benevolent patriarch reclaiming lost family heritage. He plans to surprise Michael with it as a wedding gift, Sarah said. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Surprise. Here's something I failed to steal from your mother 40 years ago. But then came the kicker. Vanessa has been talking to architects, Sarah added. They want to tear down the cabin and build something more appropriate for entertaining. It took me a moment to speak. I didn't even realize I'd stood up from the dock until I felt my coffee slosh onto my hand. Tear it down. The cabin that had weathered 4 decades, multiple storms, and 3 generations. To build some glass monstrosity with an infinity pool and a hot tub for venture capitalists. That's when I made my choice. The choice not just to preserve the cabin, but to protect it from them. The choice to remind my son not with lectures or guilt, but with consequences, that legacy is not something you reclaim when it's convenient. It's something you honor always. So I called Sarah back. Let's move forward, I told her. If I don't matter enough to be invited to my son's wedding, maybe I shouldn't pass him the key to something sacred. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" again. She just got to work. And I began preparing for what would become the hardest but clearest conversation of my life. The invitation that came next was thick enough to be a small book. Embossed with gold lettering and tucked inside layers of silk-textured paper, it was less of a wedding invitation and more of a declaration. This is not your mother's idea of marriage. Literally. It was from Michael and Vanessa, of course. Though calling it from them might be generous, this thing screamed event planner with opinions. I opened it slowly, feeling the kind of dread usually reserved for standardized tests and medical bills. And there it was. A destination wedding in Santorini. Santorini. White buildings, blue domes, luxury yachts, and photo ops that Vanessa's Instagram would milk for the next 10 years. I looked for my name. I wasn't listed as part of the ceremony, not on the important guests panel, not on the RSVP page with hotel blocks reserved for close family. I had to flip to the very last page to find Ms. Eleanor Winters, printed in a size so small I needed my reading glasses. Underneath it, optional attendance celebration to follow. Optional. Old age wisdom for the day. If you ever find yourself optional in your child's milestone moments, it's probably time to revisit your definition of legacy. So I did what any rational woman with a decades-long grudge and a perfectly good property deed would do. I booked a hair appointment. Not out of vanity, mind you. But if I was about to confront my son with the truth of my sacrifices, I wanted to make sure my split ends weren't part of the distraction. I also called Sarah. She'd finished the amendment papers for the trust. The cabin upon my death, or within a year if Michael failed to act, would go not to my son, but to the Pine Ridge Environmental Conservancy. They'd preserve it, protect it, keep it natural, keep it real. Are you sure? She asked one last time, pushing the documents across her desk. I've been preserving that place alone for 40 years, I said. If Michael can't be bothered to include me in his wedding, then maybe it's time someone else inherited my values. Sarah nodded, eyes soft. Then sign here. So I signed, and that was that. Quirky fact of the night. A group of flamingos is called a flamboyance, which, if you've ever attended a wedding hosted by someone who uninvites their own mother, feels incredibly appropriate. A few days later, Michael called. "Dinner at our place," he asked. "Vanessa and I have a few updates we wanted to share. Just us, something casual." Casual. Sure. Casual like a job interview where the other candidate is already sitting in your chair. I agreed. Polite, pleasant, and with every document I needed tucked neatly inside my handbag. Let me pause and paint the scene for you. River Point Tower. Luxury high-rise. Valet only. The kind of place where the hallway lighting makes everyone look slightly airbrushed, and the doorman wears cufflinks more expensive than my car. Michael opened the door, wearing slacks and a shirt, with those tiny tailored darts that say I haven't touched carbs since February. He smiled too wide and kissed my cheek, like he was hoping it wouldn't leave a mark. "Come in." We're so glad you could make it. Vanessa was already waiting in the dining area next to a glass table, set for three, with linen napkins and gold-rimmed flutes. She was smiling, too, but her eyes were tight, calculating. "We have some exciting news," she said, pouring champagne into the delicate flutes. "About the cabin." There it was. Michael raised his glass. "To new beginnings and family traditions." I clinked mine against theirs, even as my stomach twisted like a dish towel. "Cheers," I said, keeping my voice even. "Let's hear it." And then they laid it out. Richard had located the old family cabin. The one they believed was long gone. And as a gesture of reunion and reconciliation, he was working on buying it back as a wedding gift. From him. They would tear it down, of course. Build something modern, chic, entertain-worthy. Vanessa already had a mood board, and that's when I pulled out my purse. "Before we go too far into demolition plans," I said, placing the envelope gently on the table, "there's something you both need to see." Michael opened it first. The trust, the deed, the tax records. Photos of the cabin as it stood intact, cared for, quietly preserved. His brow furrowed. His fingers moved slower and slower across the pages. "What? Mom, this says you still own it." "Yes. Since when?" "Since always." He blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. Vanessa's glass slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor, shards of crystal dancing across the marble. None of us moved. "Dad said it was sold," Michael finally whispered. "Dad was wrong," I said. "Or lying. Take your pick." The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Only the hum of the wine fridge dared interrupt. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. And there it was. The question I'd rehearsed answers for 100 times. But now, in the room face to face with the boy I once watched collect pine cones by that lake, I didn't deliver any speech. I just looked at him and said, because it was never about the property. It was about whether anyone ever cared what I'd preserved. And I could see in that moment the story shifting. Not just in his mind, but in mine. Because I wasn't the sweet aging schoolteacher anymore. I was the woman who kept a promise. Even when no one was watching. Even when no one thought it mattered. Especially then. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. Like all the things we'd never said were finally taking up physical space between us. Vanessa stared at the floor, as if the shattered glass might reassemble itself if she just blinked hard enough. Michael, still holding the trust papers, looked like he'd found a photo of a stranger in a family album and realized it was me. "So, you just kept it all these years?" he asked, voice low. "Every year," I said calmly. "While you were in Europe, or Cabo, or wherever Richard thought culture could be purchased with a private suite. I was up at Pine Ridge, painting shutters, replacing the water heater, cleaning out gutters. Alone." Vanessa looked up slowly, her voice unsteady. "We had no idea." "No, I said you didn't. Now here's something they definitely didn't teach at Wharton, or in influencer school. Sometimes silence is the loudest form of truth." I let it ring for a while before sliding one last paper across the table, the amendment. Michael read the top line and I saw his jaw tighten. "You changed the beneficiary." "I did," I said. "After Vanessa told me very gently, of course, that I wouldn't be welcome at your wedding, I decided to stop preserving things for people who were actively erasing me." He leaned back in his chair. The tension in his shoulders made him look suddenly younger. Or maybe just unarmored. "So you're punishing me?" "No," I said firmly. "I'm protecting something sacred from becoming a vacation prop on your Instagram feed. You want to honor legacy start by recognizing it. Quirky fact sloths only poop once a week, and when they do, they risk their lives to climb down to the ground. Why scientists still don't know for sure. Maybe tradition is hardwired into the body even when it doesn't make sense anymore." Vanessa finally spoke again, less defensive this time. "Michael's dad said the cabin was just land value now, that it had no structural significance." I smiled sharp. Of course he did. Richard always had a talent for underestimating things with actual emotional weight. It's how he got where he is. Michael rubbed his temple. So that's it? You're locking me out of it forever because of the wedding? No, I said softly. Because of what the wedding revealed. But the trust amendment has a clause. 1 year. From today. If you begin to see what this place actually means, not just to me, but to who you were before all of this, then maybe it doesn't have to go to the Conservancy. And if I don't, then it goes to people who'll protect it, not redevelop it. That's when Michael did something I didn't expect. He walked over to the giant picture window overlooking the city skyline and just stared. For a long time. It was strange. He didn't look like Richard's clone anymore. He looked a little lost, like a man who'd just realized he'd been reading the wrong map. I need to think, he said finally, voice tight. Take all the time you want, I replied. Just know that for 40 years, I never stopped believing it was worth preserving. The question now is, do you? And then I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say goodbye with flair. I just walked out into the hall, past the valet desk, and back into the quiet of my small car that still smelled faintly like cinnamon gum and lavender hand sanitizer. I cried a little sure. I'm not made of granite. But I also felt lighter. Old age wisdom, sometimes the hardest conversations you'll ever have aren't about fighting. They're about revealing, not demanding anything, just showing who you really are. I spent the next few days tending my garden. I watered the basil, dead-headed the petunias, and tried not to check my phone every hour like a teenager with a crush. And then out of nowhere a message buzzed. Not from Michael. From Vanessa. Hi, Eleanor. Would you be open to meeting for coffee? Just us. I have some things I want to say. Now, I don't know about you, but I've seen enough courtroom dramas to know that when the fiancé asks to meet alone after your family's dirty laundry hits the fan, it could go either way. But I said yes. We met the next morning at a small cafe neutral ground. No reservation needed. No hostess with a clipboard and designer shoes. Vanessa was already seated when I arrived. Hair in a ponytail. No makeup. Jeans and a button-up. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked real. Thank you for coming, she said. I won't keep you long. I sat down, waiting. First, I want to apologize. Not just for uninviting you, but for assuming you were someone I didn't need to understand. She paused, took a breath. When you pulled out those papers the other night, it wasn't just shocking because of what you had done. It was shocking because of what it meant, which is that I never really knew you. Not as a mother, not as a person. I assumed you were just sweet and simple. I'm not offended, I said. You were repeating the story Michael learned from his father. She nodded. But I don't want to keep living inside that story. And I believed her. She asked about the cabin. Not about its size or resale value, but about its history. She asked who built it, where the wood came from, how I chose the curtain patterns. She listened like she actually cared. Maybe she did. Would you ever consider showing it to me? She asked. That gave me pause. Not Michael, I asked, raising an eyebrow. Not yet, she said. He needs to sit with this. I need to see it. To understand what you protected. Before I can help him see it too. And that's how I found myself making plans to return to Pine Ridge. Not alone this time, but with someone I never imagined I'd trust enough to bring into that space. The woman who had once uninvited me from my son's wedding now wanted to understand what kind of love lives in cedar beams and rain-stained windows. And I was finally ready to show her. We drove up to Pine Ridge 2 days later in her car, a sleek hybrid with leather seats that smelled like new beginnings and probably 3 varieties of almond milk. Vanessa didn't talk much during the ride, and neither did I. But the silence wasn't awkward this time. It was anticipatory. Like both of us knew we were crossing a bridge, and we weren't sure what or who we'd find on the other side. She'd swapped her usual heels for sneakers, no jewelry, no curated outfit. Just jeans, a soft grey sweater, and a nervous energy that she tried to hide by checking her side mirrors more than necessary. You okay? I asked after we passed the last gas station before the lake road. She gave a breathy laugh. I'm not sure. This feels like meeting someone's childhood best friend. Except that someone is a cabin, and the best friend might hate me. Well, I said it has good manners. Just watch your step on the porch. One of the boards likes to argue with your ankle. We turned down the gravel drive, and there it was. The cabin emerged, like it always did, through the canopy of pine trees, sunlight trickling down onto its cedar siding like a secret being slowly revealed. The green shutters I'd repainted last summer were still holding their colour. The chimney, built stone by my father's weather-worn hands, stood tall and quiet, unbothered. Vanessa stopped the car. Oh, she whispered. It's not what I imagined. What did you imagine? Something smaller, older, more forgotten. I smiled. It doesn't forget people. It just waits until they remember. We stepped out, and she turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The sound of the lake lapping gently against the dock. The wind combing through the trees. The air smelled like pine and old stories. You really came here every year, she asked. Every year, I said. While you all were in Santorini or the Hamptons, or wherever weddings need drone footage to feel real, I was here. Restaining floors, fixing door hinges, listening to loons. Quirky fact. For today, loons have 4 different calls, and one of them, the tremolo, is often called the laughing call. But it's actually a signal of unease. Funny how even nature disguises distress with something that sounds like joy. Vanessa walked up to the porch and pressed her hand to one of the beams. There's weight here, she said softly. Not just physically, like the walls are holding something. They are. I nodded. Grief, joy, pancake syrup, my son's crayon drawings, my mother's humming, my father's silence. Everything stays in the wood if you let it. She turned to me, and for once there was no performance in her eyes. May I go in? Yes, I said, but slowly. Don't barge in like you're staging it for a real estate video. Let it introduce itself. She laughed, and it was real this time. I opened the door, and the familiar creak greeted us like a song I'd hummed in my sleep. Inside, nothing had changed. The quilt on the couch, the oil lamp on the mantel, the dent in the floorboard near the kitchen where my father once dropped a box of nails and cursed in 3 languages. Vanessa walked through like someone stepping through a memory she didn't know she had. She paused at the bookshelves. Is this Hatchet? She asked, pulling out the worn paperback. Michael's favourite when he was 10. He tried to build a shelter behind the cabin once using pine branches and a mop handle. And yet he says he doesn't remember this place. He does, I said. But remembering means reconciling. And reconciling means admitting the parts of his past that don't match his curated present. She was quiet for a moment. That's what I've done too, she admitted. Curated myself. Into someone I thought people would respect. And who are you when no one's looking? Vanessa didn't answer. Instead, she moved into the kitchen, running her fingers along the tile. She picked up a chipped mug from the counter. This one's been through something. So have I replied. We spent the rest of the afternoon on the dock feet, dangling over the water. A pair of loons floated in the distance, occasionally dipping under the surface like they were eavesdropping and embarrassed about it. You're not what I expected, she said at last. Neither are you. She turned to face me, her hair gently tousled by the breeze. I've been thinking, she said, about the wedding, about everything. If Michael and I can't build a life that honors this, not just the place, but what it represents, then what's the point? Old age wisdom. A legacy isn't just what you leave behind, it's what you live through. So what do you want to do? I asked. Vanessa stared at the lake for a long time. I want to start over, but with intention this time, not spectacle. And I want you there. Not just because you're Michael's mother, but because now I know you. And I want to be the kind of woman who values this kind of history, even if I didn't grow up with it. It took me a second to respond. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I hadn't expected her to say it out loud. You think Michael's ready for that? I asked. She hesitated. I think he's closer than he realizes. But I also think you showing him this place, us talking like this, that's what cracked something open. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then Vanessa asked something I never thought I'd hear. Would you consider letting us get married here? I looked out at the water, at the trees, at the sky, softening into evening. Ask me again, I said, after he's stood where you're standing. After he's seen the marks his childhood left behind. After he remembers what legacy feels like beneath his feet. She nodded. Deal. We packed up slowly, and before she got back into the car, she turned and said, "Thank you for preserving this, and for giving me a chance to see it." "Don't thank me yet," I smiled. "I still haven't shown you where the raccoons like to break in." And just like that, the first brick of something new was laid. Not a wedding venue, not a peace treaty, but a bridge. One plank, one beam, one honest conversation at a time. Michael didn't come up right away. Vanessa returned to the city with a quiet promise and a folded napkin in her purse, one she'd used to scribble down the names of books I'd kept on the cabin shelf. She said she wanted to start understanding what shaped Michael before Richard's polished narrative took over. I believed her. But Michael, he needed time. I didn't push. I'd already spent decades waiting. Instead, I returned to my rituals, re-oiling the porch swing, trimming back the overgrown path to the dock, sweeping pine needles from the roof with a brush so old its bristles had become brittle with loyalty. And then one Sunday morning I heard the crunch of gravel tires. I was sitting on the front steps, tea in hand, reading a novel I'd already finished twice when I saw the unfamiliar rental car pull up. It was silver practical. Michael stepped out wearing jeans. No tie, no suit jacket. Just him. He stood there awkwardly like a kid at his first school dance. "Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I wasn't sure if you'd be here." "Where else would I be?" I replied calmly. He walked slowly up the path, pausing near the garden bed, eyeing the sunflowers I'd planted that spring. His mouth twitched into a crooked smile. "You still grow those?" "They always face the light," I said, "even after storms." We stood in silence for a moment before I broke it. "So, did Vanessa tell you?" "Everything. And," he sighed, "and I don't know what to say. That doesn't sound like an apology wrapped in excuses." "Try anyway." He sat down beside me. No fanfare. Just lowered himself onto the wood, resting his arms on his knees like he used to as a boy. "I forgot," he began. "Not just the cabin. I forgot you." "No, Michael. You remembered a version of me that was easier to fit into the life you were building. But I never stopped being this." I waved my hand toward the trees, the water, the little stretch of earth I'd kept breathing. "I know," he whispered. There was a long pause. "Why didn't you fight harder to be in my life?" He asked, his voice cracking just enough to tell me it was real. I turned to look at him. "Because I thought you'd come back when you were ready to see me. Not as the woman your father described. Not as the woman your fiancé dressed up for brunches. But as the woman who kept this place alive so you could one day come home to it." Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away. "I thought Dad saved everything," he muttered. "He saved face," I corrected. "I saved roots." Then something remarkable happened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pine cone. Brown, symmetrical, still fresh. "I found this under the dock," he said. "Same kind I used to collect, right?" I smiled. "You labeled them forest treasures. You insisted on capital letters." He let out a soft laugh, the kind that comes from deep memory. A healing sound. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, "for making you feel like you didn't matter." I nodded slowly. "I know you are." We sat together until the sun started tilting westward. The lake shimmered with the low light, and the breeze picked up just enough to make the wind chimes on the porch hum a quiet harmony. "Vanessa told me about your conversation," he said finally. "About what you showed her. About what you changed in the trust. Do you understand why I asked?" "I think so. I think legacy isn't just about what we leave, it's about who we become while protecting it." There it was. "You want to see the inside?" I asked. He nodded. I stood open the screen door and let him walk in first. He stopped immediately, eyes scanning every corner. The smell, he whispered. I remember it. Wood. Lemon oil. A little mildew, I said with a wink. He moved from room to room, slowly, like a man rediscovering a language he used to speak fluently, but hadn't heard in years. When he got to the kitchen, he ran his fingers across the counter, stopped at the bookshelf, and smiled at the old hatchet copy. You kept everything. Not everything I said. Just the things that mattered. When he came back out to the porch, he didn't say much. Just sat again, shoulders a little more settled. I want to be better, he said. Then start here, I replied. Not with promises, with presence. He looked out at the lake. Vanessa and we're thinking of postponing the wedding, doing something smaller, simpler. Maybe here? It's not just a backdrop, Michael. I know, it's a witness. And that right there was when I knew. Not just that I'd done the right thing, but that something was starting to shift. In him. In us. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes on a quiet Sunday with tea pine cones and a man finally remembering who he used to be. And the woman who never stopped waiting for him to come back. I didn't call Sarah right away. After Michael left the cabin that evening with the pine cone tucked carefully into his coat pocket, and a quiet, I'll be back next weekend. I just sat on the porch swing for a long while, watching the last light bleed out of the sky like warm ink on paper. Thinking, not about legal clauses or trust funds, just about breath, just about stillness, about how long it had taken to reach this place, not the cabin, but this emotional clearing where the weight between us had finally lifted. Sarah did call me, though. So she asked, voice lined with professional curiosity and maternal pride. Did he come? He did. And he brought a pine cone. She laughed, one of those short bursts that sounded like she didn't mean to, but couldn't help it. You going to undo the amendment? Not yet, I said. He's at the trailhead, not at the summit. Well, she said, let me know when you're ready to sign him back in. I'll keep the paperwork warm. That night, I lit the oil lamp again. It cast the same honey-colored glow it always had, flickering against the window panes like a living heartbeat. I walked into the back room, the one Michael used to call the fort, and opened the cedar chest where I kept our oldest family things. Inside my mother's patchwork apron, a photo of my father building the dock in cut-off jeans and work boots, Michael's drawing of a loon wearing sunglasses. I held that one for a while. The crayon lines had faded, but not disappeared. Like us. The next weekend he returned, this time with a small toolbox, 2 sandwiches from a deli in town, and a question. Can I help fix the dock? I didn't answer right away. Just handed him the second hammer. And we got to work. No speeches. No big moment. Just shared effort and the rhythm of nails being driven into old wood. After an hour, he stood brushed sawdust off his jeans and looked out over the lake. Vanessa wants to come back. Not to plan anything, just to be here. She can, I said. But this place knows the difference between visitors and caretakers. He nodded like he understood. And then he surprised me. I found a photo, he said, pulling a folded print from his back pocket. From when I was maybe 7. You're sitting on the dock, holding a mug. I'm next to you pointing at the water. I don't even remember the picture being taken. I took it gently. I remembered the moment. He'd been asking if frogs could breathe underwater. I didn't know the answer, so we made up a story about a frog who wore a tiny scuba mask and carried matchsticks as paddles. Why did we stop coming? He asked. I turned the photo over. On the back in faded pen it read, Summer 1994, Eleanor and Michael. Frogs and paddles, because your father didn't think it mattered. And I didn't want to drag you somewhere you were being taught to forget. He was quiet, but you kept coming, because I never forgot. Old age wisdom for the day. Just because someone edits you out of their narrative doesn't mean your chapters weren't true, or worth preserving. The next few visits blurred together. Michael replaced a cracked window pane in the kitchen. Vanessa brought up a basket of linens and sat with me folding napkins while asking about my mother's recipe for apple jam. They didn't make promises. They just showed up. That was all I'd ever really wanted. And then one morning, Michael arrived early. Too early for casual. He looked nervous. "We want to ask you something." I arched an eyebrow, sipping my tea. "We want to get married here. Small, just family, a few close friends, but only if you're the one who gives me away." That stopped me, not because of the gesture, but because of the phrasing. "Gives you away?" I asked, setting my cup down. "Michael, I never had you to give. I raised you. I taught you. I held your hand through every scraped knee and thunderstorm. But you've always belonged to yourself." He blinked. I smiled gently. "But I'll walk beside you. That I can do." We hugged on the porch, our second hug in 10 years. The first was when his son was born. This one lasted longer. And in that moment I knew it was time. The next day, I met Sarah for lunch. She brought the paperwork. We sat under a red umbrella outside a quiet cafe, and I signed the amendment again. This time, I wrote his name back in, Michael Winters. Beneficiary of the trust, future steward of the cabin, but now not by birthright, by understanding, by choice, by growth. When I handed Sarah the folder, she didn't say anything for a while. Just looked at me the way friends do when they've witnessed your whole story, your rise, your fall, and your quiet redemption. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected. "Me, you, and one very stubborn pinecone collector." As I walked home that day, I passed a small child crouching on the sidewalk, intently inspecting an ant parade. I smiled. Curiosity, wonder, unfiltered presence. The things we start with, and if we're lucky, circle back to. It doesn't matter how far we drift, or how fancy the skyline becomes. Sometimes the most honest thing we can do is return to the place where we first noticed the world. Michael came back to me, not because I demanded it, but because I made space for him to rediscover what was never truly gone. The wedding was scheduled for early October. Not Santorini, not Napa, not even a boutique vineyard in Hudson Valley with string lights and gluten-free hors d'oeuvres. It would be here at the cabin, in Pine Ridge, under a sky that actually meant something. We chose the clearing near the edge of the lake, where the old oak tree had stood watch over our family for decades. Michael hung lanterns from the lower branches. Vanessa arranged for wildflowers, nothing flown, in nothing, out of season. She even called me one evening to ask which local bakery made the not-too-sweet lemon cake I once served her. "I think we'd rather have cake that tastes like a memory," she said, "than one that looks like a sculpture." Now that was growth. We kept the guest list small. No corporate colleagues. No distant cousins from Connecticut with nothing to say but everything to judge. Just people who'd earned a seat, not expected one. And here's the funny thing. There was no tension. No silent drama. No secret resentment wafting in the breeze. There was just belonging. The day before the ceremony, Michael asked to stay overnight at the cabin. Alone. Said he wanted one night to himself, in the place where he used to fall asleep to loon calls and wake up to the sound of bacon popping in a cast-iron pan. I left him a note on the kitchen table. "Your old quilt's in the cedar chest. The frogs still croak at dusk. The trick to the oil lamp is to breathe in as you light it, not out." Mum. When I returned the next morning, he was already up barefoot on the dock, sipping coffee from my chipped mug. "I didn't sleep much," he admitted. "Why not? Too many ghosts. But they weren't haunting me. They were reminding me." "Of what?" He smiled, squinting into the sunrise. "Of the boy I was, and the mother I forgot." I didn't reply. Just stepped beside him, feeling the boards creak with familiarity. Later that day, we dressed simply. No tux, no veil. Just light grey linen for him. A soft blue dress for Vanessa that fluttered like lake water when she walked toward the clearing. And when the time came, Michael turned to me and held out his arm. "Walk with me," he asked. I slipped my hand through his elbow. Always. The ceremony was short. The vows, handwritten. Vanessa spoke about building something from the roots up, about legacy, about home not being square footage, but intention. I saw Sarah dab her eyes. Michael spoke last. I once thought legacy was something we inherit, but I've learned it's something we recognize. I didn't build this cabin. I didn't choose the color of its shutters or the shape of the doorknobs. But my mother did, and now I do. Because love doesn't need to be perfect to be preserved. The applause was soft, respectful, like the forest itself was listening. Afterward, we ate on long picnic tables under string lights we powered from a small generator. There were mismatched plates, borrowed cutlery, and laughter that didn't echo because it didn't need to. And then, at some point in the evening, Vanessa leaned in close and whispered, "We don't want a honeymoon. We want a season. Here, just us, learning how to live in what you preserved." I blinked back tears I hadn't planned to shed. "You sure? We're not interested in perfect. We're interested in real." Later that night, after the last guest had driven off and the candles had burned low, I stood alone on the dock. The lake was silver under the moonlight, calm. And for the first time in years, I felt not just seen, but witnessed. This wasn't a victory. It was a homecoming. Michael had remembered. Vanessa had transformed, and I quietly, patiently had held the space for it all to happen. Old age truth. Sometimes your greatest act of motherhood isn't what you give your child, but what you preserve in silence until they're ready to return. As I walked back to the cabin, lantern in hand, the wind carried one last loon call across the lake. Not a warning, not a laugh, but a welcome. The days that followed the wedding moved differently, slower, softer, like time had exhaled. Michael and Vanessa stayed on at the cabin, just as they'd promised. At first, I lingered nearby, just in case they needed anything. I showed them where I stored the quilts, how to prime the old pump for the outdoor sink, which cupboard hid the matches for the stove. But by the end of that first week, they insisted I head back into town. "We've got this," Mom Michael said with a quiet confidence I hadn't seen in him in years. Besides, Vanessa added, "It's our turn to care for your sanctuary." That word care meant more to me than I could say. Back in my small home on Willow Street, the silence was different now. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. I returned to my routines. Morning walks to the farmer's market, evenings with a book in my lap and the cat curled at my feet. But my thoughts stayed tethered to the lake. One evening, I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope addressed in Vanessa's careful handwriting. Inside a photo, Michael and Vanessa both barefoot standing on the dock. Between them, a carved wooden sign now hanging over the cabin door. It read, "Winter's Legacy Lodge, S-Gen, 1972. Preserved 1984-2024, loved forever." I held the photo in both hands and let the tears fall, not of sadness, but of release. They got it. They really got it. A few weeks later, Michael invited me back up. "No pressure," he said. "We just want you to see what we've done." I drove up on a crisp afternoon, leaves crunching under my tires, the trees burning gold and orange like the forest had dressed up just for me. The first thing I noticed was the porch swing. Michael had refinished it. Vanessa had sewn new cushions, hand-stitched in a pine tree pattern. The second thing was the inside rearranged, slightly modernized, but unmistakably home. The bookshelves remained. So did the oil lamp. But new frames now hung on the walls, black and white photos of my father building the dock of me and young Michael crouching beside a bucket of pine cones of my mother laughing over a stew pot. In the kitchen, they'd added a new note to the old corkboard. "House rule number 1, if you find a pine cone, it's yours to name." I laughed out loud. Vanessa was baking something apple jam muffins, she said, and Michael was chopping kindling out back. There was music playing softly from a vintage radio. James Taylor, if I'm not mistaken. "You okay?" Vanessa asked, offering me a mug of tea. "Better than okay," I said. "I'm seen." Later that evening, we sat around a small fire pit they'd built just off the porch. Michael poked at the flames with a stick like he used to when he was a boy. He looked at me across the glow. "You were right. You know," he said. "About what? This place, it doesn't just hold history. It holds truth. And I don't want to lose either. He pulled something from his jacket, a small notebook, bound in soft leather worn at the edges. I've been writing, he said almost sheepishly. Just memories. Yours, mine. Stories about the lake, about Dad, about us. He handed it to me. I think maybe this place isn't just a legacy. Maybe it's the beginning of a book. I turned it over in my hands, heart too full for words. That night, as I lay under the old roof in my familiar bed, I listened to the sounds I had come to know, like lullabies, crickets, soft waves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But this time, I wasn't the keeper of a memory. I was part of a legacy being lived. In the morning, as we shared coffee on the porch, Michael turned to me and said, "I know you changed the trust back," Sarah told me. I raised an eyebrow. And I won't fight you if you change it again. If you want it to go to the Conservancy, still I'll understand. I looked at him, really looked, at the man who used to be my little boy, at the husband Vanessa had chosen, at the caretaker of our story. It's yours, I said, because you remembered. We didn't need a legal signature to seal that. The cabin would endure not because of documents, but because of devotion. That was the real inheritance. Not land, not wood, but awareness, and I trusted him to carry it forward. That winter snow came early to Pine Ridge. Thick, soft drifts piled along the porch railings. Icicles clung to the eaves like quiet ornaments. Michael sent me photos of the cabin covered in white, the smoke curling from the chimney, the lake frozen solid. "We made stew tonight," he texted. "Your mother's recipe, I think. Vanessa says it needed more time. I say she's wrong." The photo that followed made me laugh out loud. Michael holding a wooden spoon like a trophy, Vanessa in the background, giving a dramatic thumbs down, both wrapped in matching flannel. They were living there now full time. The cabin had become more than a retreat. It was home. Not just because it sheltered them, but because it held them. That month, I went back up with a box of old paper's letters from my parents, yellowed sketches of cabin layouts, even the original deed written in shaky cursive. Michael spread them out on the kitchen table like sacred artifacts. "We should build an archive," he said. "We already did," I replied, patting his shoulder. "It's called memory." He smiled. But the idea stuck. A week later, Vanessa cleared out one of the back closets and started what she called the story shelf. Each item was labeled, dated, catalogued. Photos were mounted. Audio recordings were made. Vanessa had me sit down one snowy afternoon and talk for nearly 2 hours straight, while she asked questions like an NPR host. "What's something about the cabin nobody else knows?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "There's a heart carved into the underside of the dining table. Your husband did it when he was 6. Said he wanted to marry the forest." They both stared, then dove under the table. The laughter that followed echoed into the rafters. That spring, Vanessa planted a garden. Not a decorative one, but vegetables and herbs, carrots, radishes, rosemary, and chives. She called it Eleanor's bed. I rolled my eyes, but I loved it. Michael fixed the dock again this time, replacing the end boards entirely, making it wide enough for 2 chairs and a table. "Sunset coffee spot," he said. "More like sunset arguments if you forget the bug spray," I replied. We had them, of course, the arguments. Legacy doesn't cancel out difference. But now there was space for disagreement without destruction. A shared foundation that didn't crumble under pressure. Then, in early summer, something unexpected arrived, a letter. Handwritten. From Richard. It was brief. A single paragraph. "Michael told me about the wedding. About the cabin. About you. I never said this properly, but you were right to keep it. And I was wrong to think it didn't matter. I hope you'll accept this as what it is, not a reconciliation, but a recognition." I didn't write back. Some ghosts don't need exercising, just acknowledgement. And even then, only once. The seasons passed gently. Each time I visited, something had changed, but never too much. The curtains were new. The pantry better organized. A bird feeder now hung near the back window. But the essence remained. One afternoon in August, as we sat out by the dock with iced tea and a breeze curling around our ankles, Michael looked over at me. Do you ever think about selling it the cabin? I mean, what if one day it's too much? I shook my head. We don't sell memory, I said. We tend it. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. He nodded quiet. You think your grandchildren will want to come here someday? If they've got any sense, they'll demand it. We both laughed. That night, I slept in the guest room, the same one that used to be Michael's childhood bedroom. The posters were gone, but the windows still faced east. I woke up to soft light spilling across the floor and the smell of fresh coffee drifting down the hall, and I realized something. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped thinking of it as mine, not because I'd let it go, but because it was finally being held by others who loved it just as fiercely. I walked outside, barefoot dew, dampening the cuffs of my pajama pants, and sat on the steps. Birdsong filled the air. The loons were quiet, but I could hear frogs in the reeds. And I thought, this is what endurance looks like. Not perfection, not preservation at the expense of joy. Just something kept alive long enough to be shared. And that, I decided, was enough. Autumn came again this time, more golden than I remembered. Maybe because I was watching through clearer eyes. Or maybe because the years had finally stopped feeling like something I was fighting against and started feeling like something I was grateful to carry. Michael and Vanessa were preparing for a small community gathering at the cabin. Nothing fancy, just neighbors, a potluck, a bonfire. They'd hung a handmade sign by the road. Pine Ridge Autumn Day, all welcome. When I arrived, the place was buzzing. Kids chased each other around the maple trees. An elderly couple from down the road sat near the fire pit sipping cider. There were paper lanterns strung between branches, and Michael had somehow rigged up a projector to show old home movies on a white sheet pinned to the side of the cabin. One of those movies was of me, a much younger me, standing by the dock, arms crossed and laughing, clearly mid-scolding Michael for tracking mud into the cabin. I barely recognized myself. But when I looked over and saw my son watching the video, smiling with full eyes, I realized something. He didn't just remember the cabin. He remembered me. Did you digitize all of these? I asked, stepping up beside him. Vanessa did, he said. She found the tapes in a box labeled, "Don't touch unless you're bleeding." I laughed. Well, that does sound like me. He nodded, still watching the flickering image on the screen. I never knew how much I missed this, he said quietly. It's not about missing, I told him. It's about finally being still enough to hear it call you back. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone and the fire had died to glowing embers, I wandered down to the dock alone. I stood there for a while, wrapped in a cardigan arms, crossed against the chill, and watched the moonlight ripple over the water. And then I felt its soft footsteps behind me. Vanessa, do you ever get tired? She asked. Of what? Holding so much history. I smiled, glancing sideways at her. Sometimes. But history isn't heavy when it's shared. She stepped up beside me. I want to keep telling it, she said. Not just through photo albums or dinners. I mean really telling it. Maybe a book. Maybe a documentary. Something that lets others feel what this place holds. I was quiet for a long time, then nodded. If you tell it with heart and not with polish, it'll speak. She looked at me, eyes soft. You know, you're the root, right? I chuckled. I thought I was the porch swing. You're both, she said. We stood there a bit longer before heading inside. The cabin was still warm, with the scent of cinnamon and pine laughter lingering like incense in the beams. Michael was asleep on the couch, a book resting on his chest. Firelight, painting his face in amber and shadow. I pulled a blanket over him and kissed his forehead. It felt like something I hadn't done in decades, but also like I'd never stopped. Old age wisdom. Sometimes what you think you've lost is simply waiting for you to look again. Before heading to bed, I took one last look around the room. The photographs, the old furniture, the lanterns flickering low, and that carved heart under the table. Still there, still stubborn, still holding, just like me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, thick envelope, hand-addressed. embossed seal from the Pine Ridge Land Conservancy. I knew before I opened it what it was about. I'd made inquiries years ago after Richard and I divorced. Back then, I was convinced that no one in our family would ever return to the cabin, not with love at least. So I'd reached out quietly, asked about donation protocols, about legacy preservation, about what would happen if I handed over everything to people I didn't know simply because I believed they might care more than the ones I'd raised. But I never signed anything. And now everything was different. Still, the envelope sat on my table for days. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I drove up to the cabin. Michael met me in the driveway holding a mug of tea already made the way I like it. Strong, no sugar splash of milk. "Something told me you'd be coming," he said. Something or someone, I asked. He grinned. Okay, it was Vanessa. Inside, the place smelled like cinnamon and cedar. The fire was going. A new quilt draped over the back of the couch, a gift from the neighbors after the harvest gathering. They'd made a home out of it, not a museum, and I realized that was better. Later that night, I pulled the envelope from my bag and placed it on the table between us. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. Michael nodded, slowly. "The Conservancy offer. I requested it when I didn't believe we had a future here. When I thought this place would die with me." He didn't interrupt. He knew better now. "But I was wrong," I said. I opened the envelope, pulled out the contract, and quietly, deliberately tore it in half. Then in quarters. Then into tiny, irretrievable pieces. Michael watched me, his eyes soft. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure." I picked up a pine cone from the shelf nearby, one he'd painted gold when he was 5. It still had glitter in the creases. "This place was never about preservation," I said. "It was about participation, about showing up, about knowing the stories in the wood and the breath in the walls." He took my hand. "We won't forget," he said. "We'll tell it all, over and over again." The next morning, we walked the perimeter of the land. Vanessa joined us, camera slung over her shoulder. She paused often to snap photos of mossbark wildflowers pushing up from the frost-softened earth. She asked questions about who planted what, about which trees were original, about the way the light changed with the seasons. And I answered, with the kind of memory that lives in the bones. At one point, we stopped by the base of the old oak tree, the one that shaded the wedding. Michael ran his hand along the bark, now split and gnarled from years of growth. "Think this'll still be standing when we're gone?" he asked. I tilted my head. "Maybe, maybe not, but something else will be." And I meant it, because the thing about legacy is it doesn't have to be carved in stone or notarized in ink. It lives in gestures, in echoes, in the sound of bare feet on pine floors, and the smell of fresh apple jam in October. It lives in the way we choose to return. Later that afternoon, I packed up to leave. Michael carried my bag to the car. Vanessa tucked a mason jar of soup into the passenger seat, and I stood for a moment on the porch. Not as a visitor, not even as the matriarch, just as someone who'd finally found peace. "Don't be a stranger," Vanessa said. "I live 30 miles away," I smirked. "Still, you're always welcome." Michael hugged me, arms strong, familiar. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For not giving up on us." I touched his cheek. It was never about giving up, just about giving space. I drove away slowly, watching the cabin shrink in my rearview mirror until it tucked itself back into the trees, content. And that night, back in my house, I lit the oil lamp one last time, just to feel the glow, just to remember. I sat in my chair with a pen and paper and began to write. Not a legal document, not a journal, just a story. A story about a cabin, a woman, a boy who forgot and then remembered, and all the life that happened in between. Epilogue. 300 words. If you're still here, still listening, then maybe this story stirred something in you. Maybe you too have a place you thought was lost, a memory buried beneath years of distance or silence, a love that needed time, a voice that needed space. Maybe you're holding your own version of a pine cone, small, quiet, easy to miss, but holy in its own way. If so, then I hope you'll remember this. It's never too late to come back. Never too late to repair what was fractured, to reclaim what matters, to write someone back into your life, not with grand gestures, but with steady hands and a listening heart. This was never a story about a house in the woods. It was always about how we choose to belong, and how, when given time, trust, and truth, we find our way home. So tonight, may you rest knowing that even what's forgotten is not always lost. That even after long silence, love can speak again. And that maybe, just maybe, someone is waiting quietly, patiently for you to remember. Good night.